This talk is titled 50 Ways to Lose Your Fertility. After doing the research for endocrine disrupting chemicals, it should be 1,000 ways to lose your fertility, because there are almost 1,000 endocrine disrupting chemicals now in general circulation. In 2006, the Danish Ministry of the Environment launched a preventative campaign warning pregnant women not to use cosmetics, makeup or paint. And it provided pamphlets to all of the maternity wards in Denmark because of their concerns about their exposure to phthalates. That's pretty progressive for a country to do this. So a lot of the data that I'll give you comes from Denmark, and in particular its impact on men's health. Now, I know this is a Women's Health Day, but of course without men there wouldn't be women. So I think it's really important that we have a look at men and women's health, because I used to joke to my naturopaths when I was lecturing at university, it won't be a nuclear bomb that wipes us out, it will be infertility. Because of the very chemicals we have launched since World War II. There's over 100,000 now in commercial use. Most of these have never been tested for their impact on human health. So let's get stuck into 1,000 ways to lose your fertility. And in fact, I thought this is a great title for my next book. Genetics loads the gun and the environment is the trigger. When the Human Genome Project was finished in 2003, I think they thought it was going to be like Gattaca. We'll take a DNA swab and we're going to predict what diseases you're going to have. And instead, it opened up Pandora's box. That the lifestyle, the diet, and the environment are the triggers. That you could have a genome that makes you susceptible but may never express itself unless you have a certain diet, lifestyle or environmental contaminants. And I think this is a really important part which drives the importance of an organisation like Actum providing this information. So what is an endocrine disruptor? It's an exogenous substance or mixture that alters the function of the endocrine system and consequently causes adverse health effects in an intact organism or its progeny or subpopulations. What we're going to do is have a look at the history of endocrine disrupting chemicals, and remarkably it starts in the 1940s in Australia. There was a sheep ranch in Perth around this time that was very lucrative, and over a period of 15 years most of the ewes became infertile. They started giving birth to stillborn lambs, and in fact it almost sent this farm into bankruptcy, to the extent where the federal government, Australian federal government, got involved to figure out what the hell happened to this sheep farm and to the ewes that they became so infertile and gave birth to these huge numbers of stillborn lambs. And what had happened earlier, 15 years earlier, was that the farmers had planted a Mediterranean type of clover all over the ranch, which we now know contains a phytoestrogen, Hormone, which increases the cervical mucus production and therefore affects sperm transport so that fertility cannot occur. And what they discovered from this is that plants, some plants, produce oral contraceptives. Why? Because plants cannot defend themselves. So what they do is they produce oral contraceptives to kill off their predators so that they can survive, because in the end, that's what it's all about. So I'm going to talk a bit about phytoestrogens versus xenoestrogens and where the place is for phytoestrogens in our diet, and how they compare, because this is a really big part of the issue with the data coming out now and its impact on hyperspadias and cryptorchidism, etc., and early puberty and breast cancer and testicular cancer are all very much related to xenoestrogen exposure. Of course, the ancients used fennel and pomegranate and wild carrot for birth control and abortions for many centuries because of their high levels of phytoestrogens. The fact that plants produce oral contraceptives is a novel way to think about, plants aren't always there. They're there to survive, just like you and I. So it put plants on a whole different scale in my head after reading that. Or vegetarians.
You do feel sorry for vegetarians. I mean, they've got this about our animals, and it's like, well, I think plants are alive and living. Exactly.
Rachel Carson, a marine biologist and environmentalist who was really one of the founders of the environmental movement in the 1960s. Has anyone heard of Rachel Carson? Really absolutely important that you read her book, Silent Spring, published in 1962. She was the first one to connect pesticide exposure with infertility in the top predators of wildlife, both in fish, in birds, particularly the bald eagle. What was happening was that the eggshells were thinning to such a degree that the chicks were hatching early and dying, and it almost led to the extinction of this type of species. And when she started to look at the research of what the impact of pesticides on wildlife, she realised that something drastic was happening in the environment as a result of the tons and tons of use of organochlorine pesticides, which are endocrine disrupting chemicals which were occurring in the 1950s and the 60s, etc., including in Australia. So that is a very important book, Silent Spring, and because of her work, even though she was chastised by the chemical industries who tried to bring her down on her research, eventually her work led to the development of the US Environmental Protection Agency. So therefore she's won many awards as a result of it, even though she died of cancer, which they suspect was pesticide related. She was a pioneer, like so many of them are, and wrote an incredible book that people still talk about to this day, and it really is the beginning of what happened in the wildlife and how much it is reflecting what's happening in human epidemiological studies. So, according to the evidence, the European Commission have indicated that our lessons in wildlife is that endocrine disrupting chemicals in marine molluscs known to be due to exposure to anti-fouling paints can cause imposex or male genitalia in females. Anti-fouling paints has been a big problem. The endocrine disrupting chemical is tributyltin, which is a very strong xenoestrogen that has caused hermaphrodites amongst the fish, etc., in a lot of marine wildlife because of the use of this anti-fouling paint in ships. Feminisation in male freshwater fish, in rivers and lakes exposed to treated sewage effluents in many parts of Europe, similar to changes also being noticed in estuaries. A lot of fish becoming hermaphrodites as a result of, especially if they're near these sewage outlets, which has, makes you question the fact, like countries like Israel, the UK, parts of Australia relying on recycled effluent could have an impact, of course, on reproductive and fertility and breast cancer risks down the track, because phthalates you can't get rid of in any type of water filtration system. Reverse osmosis won't touch phthalates. Also, the excretion and metabolic byproducts from the contraceptive pill, feminising the fish and estuaries is an issue. How do you get rid of it? Good question. We have 13 billion kilometre cubed of water on this planet. It's the same that existed 6 billion years ago when water came on the planet. It's all recycled through the water cycle, which we all learn about at school. The more you contaminate it, the more it eventually gets through and it keeps coming back to us. So until we see that we are intimately connected by our environments, that the air we now breathe, that the water we now ingest, that the food we now take becomes part of us and replaces every atom in our body within 7 years or so, more for bones. So if we keep continuing contaminating the environment and our waterways, it's ultimately us that's going to get affected. Impaired reproductive development and abnormalities of the reproductive system in alligators. I thought it was quite interesting looking at the research about the alligators in the Great Lakes in the US, that we managed almost to wipe out a species that survived the last ice age simply in 30 years of pesticide spraying. Now, the interesting thing, when they were testing the water for these pesticides, they couldn't find them. Pesticides aren't the problem, we can't find it in the water. Of course they couldn't find it in the water because the pesticides were getting into the algae and then bioaccumulating up the entire food chain. So it was absorbed into the algae, the little fish eat the algae, the bigger fish eat the little fish, and then the seagulls eat them, and the large top predators, etc., the alligators, etc., were eating high levels of these organochlorine pesticides and endocrine disrupting chemicals because it was going up the food chain. We call this bioaccumulation. And when they looked at the alligators, 50% of them, their penises had shrunk significantly, and many of them were infertile within less than 30 years of crop dusting within that area. But we know, of course, crop dusting is not only is it ineffective as a pest control because less than 99% actually hits the target plant, most of it gets into the global distillation system, which is why the livers of polar bears have detectable levels of DDT, even though spraying didn't occur within 15,000 kilometres of their areas. So until we tackle this on a much larger global area, we will all be affected by this in some way or form. According to the European Commission, other adverse changes in wildlife as a result of exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals includes reproductive impairment or abnormalities in whales, in seals and polar bears, impaired immune function in seals, skeletal deformities, and worldwide decline of frogs. In fact, there's been a 50% decline in frogs, and many of the researchers in this area believe pesticides is the main reason why this is the case. In my book, I talk about, the first thing we want to look at as a building biologist for a healthy home is to look at the block of land and go, is it supporting life? Is there grass here? Is there wildlife here? Can I hear the birds? Can I hear the frogs? Because frogs and bellbirds are one of the most sensitive to changes in the environment. So if there is vitality on the land, there's more likely to be vitality provided to the occupants in the house. So that is such a simple concept, and yet it's such an important one. Fresh air, not being near major arterial routes, and all of those other issues. In history in humans, diethylstilbestrol was synthesised in 1938. Between 1948 and 1971, it was prescribed to over 6 million women to prevent miscarriages, as an anti-galactagogue to prevent breastfeeding, menopause, as the morning after pill, for acne. In fact, it was marketed to healthy women with normal pregnancies to have a healthier, bigger baby. This is the first time that a hormone endocrine disrupting chemical was given to the women. And ironically, in 1940, there was an article published in the French medical journal that stated that male mice given diethylstilbestrol increased significantly their risk of mammary tumours. Despite this, the thinking at the time in medicine is whatever happens in animal studies in rats will not reflect what's going on in humans. When it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, what's happening in vivo and in vitro studies is actually demonstrating what's happening in humans. So diethylstilbestrol ended up causing no problems in the parents at all, not in the mothers who took the drug, just like thalidomide. The problem was it affected their offspring. Many of the daughters of the mothers who took diethylstilbestrol at critical windows of development between 7 and 14 weeks of pregnancy. Endocrine disruption is all about critical windows of development. So between the 7th and 14 weeks is when the worst effects occurred on their daughters. It increased the risk of clear cell adenocarcinoma of the vagina in these daughters. They have a 40-fold increased risk of vaginal cancer as compared to the general public. About 1 in 1,000 DES daughters will have this rare form of vaginal cancer. And even though there were studies coming out in the 60s saying, look, we're getting more girls with these side effects, this unusual rare form of vaginal cancer, the industry didn't want to know about it. Increased risk of breast cancer. So if they didn't die of vaginal cancer, when they get into the menopause, they have a much higher, almost a doubling the incidence of breast cancer as a result of being the daughter of a mother who took DES. And a lot of the research is stating that a mother could have taken it throughout, her pregnancy from the 2nd and 3rd trimester and had hundreds of DES pills and had no impact on her daughter. Other mothers taking 1 pill between week 7 and 14 and then had devastating impacts. When it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, that critical window of development is absolutely essential because that's when most of the adverse health effects are occurring in offspring. And this is what we've learnt about the wildlife studies. The parents weren't affected by the drugs. What was being affected were the offspring, and more importantly, their offspring. Because of course when you have a fetus, their gonads are already forming very early on. So you're not just affecting them, you're affecting their children, the grandchildren, because their reproductive organs are already starting very early on from week 7 on in an embryo. We call this a transgenerational effect. And as I was saying to Michelle, there's some, having looked at environmental health for a long time, because, mine started with 10 miscarriages, electromagnetic field exposure, etc. Nothing shocks me much nowadays. Putting this lecture together took it to a whole new level, and even I was surprised by some of the data that I'll go through that concerns me, because normally I have a solution to everything, EMFs, keep a distance away from the source, blah, 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 chemicals used a lot less, endocrine disrupting chemicals, wow. We're talking what happened in your great-grandmother affects you, and you're not even exposed to the drug, but you've got the ramifications of that. And I'll talk about how chemicals are regulated in Australia and why we urgently need reform to adjust this. In the 1960s, a Danish-born chemist, Søren Jensen, identified PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which were used in industrial solvents and cleaners in his wife and infant daughter. And this was quite shocking, because we know this is a hormone-disrupting chemical, and he certainly didn't expect to see it in his infant daughter, who was being breastfed. She hadn't eaten anything yet. She was being breastfed. So he could only conclude that it was getting in through the breast milk. And that was another medical myth at the time, that the mother will protect the fetus from harmful chemicals. In the 1950s and 60s, this was the state of play in medicine, that only radiation affects the fetus and that no harmful chemicals get through the placenta. Of course, we now know when thalidomide came on the market that this was actually not the case at all. That in fact, many of the chemicals, environmental chemicals we're exposed to nowadays, and endocrine disrupting chemicals are no exception. They are lipophilic. They love fat. So wherever the fat goes, that's where these endocrine disrupting chemicals go. And with breast milk being over 90% fat, this is why the World Health Organization states that breast milk is the most accurate biomarker to determine how toxic the environment has become. Now, can you imagine a period of time where we say, don't breast milk because your breast milk's too toxic? The ramifications on that child's gut flora, because we no longer have probiotics that we can provide and all the immune stimulants that we need in our breast milk to provide and give to our children, because the environment has become so toxic. And I'll go into reasons why this is getting so bad. 1989, Soto and Sonnenschein. Anna Soto and Carlos Sonnenschein, they're sort of my heroes. I've been looking at their research for quite some time. They were looking at the relationship between breast cancer and estrogen. They got a whole lot of test tubes, they added breast cancer cells to all of them, and then they added estrogen to half of them. And when they added estrogen, the breast cancer cells multiplied, indicating that breast cancer is an estrogen-dependent cancer. What they didn't expect is that the breast cancer cells where estrogen had not been applied, they multiplied almost to the same extent as if estrogen had been added. They thought, this can't be right, so they scrapped the experiment and they started again. Whole lot of test tubes, breast cancer cells and all of them, estrogen in half, they multiplied, but so did the control group multiplied as well. It took them months to figure out what the heck had gone on in that control group, and eventually they discovered a chemical in the polystyrene test tube, which was a nonylphenol plastic phthalate that was causing those breast cancer cells to multiply. And that's when they started to think about, wow, where are these xenoestrogens, these external estrogens that are coming into our everyday environments? So they're probably the two top players that are involved in endocrine disruption and talk a lot about this. And of course, the industry don't like them because, they're questioning the plastics industry and, pesticides and a lot of chemicals. I'll go into detail on the amount of chemicals shortly. In 1990s, Our Stolen Future was written by two researchers, Theo Colborn, Diane Demansky and John Peters Meyer. Excellent book. Has anyone read this? definitely worth reading. Our Stolen Future really provided all of the carried on where Silent Spring stopped, and when, of course, because she passed away shortly after producing the book from cancer, and it really went on to look at all the wildlife studies, endocrine disruption, and our knowledge about its impact on reproductive life and fertility. An excellent, excellent book, and it's definitely well worth reading. It's a great read and still very relevant to this day. And pretty much what's stated in here is still an issue because none of it has been addressed by anybody. As a result of this, 35 scientists, politicians, environmentalists from the US and from the UK and from Europe got together in 1998, and environmentalists, to talk about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And they found, as they were talking about these girls who were getting vaginal cancer from their exposure when their mothers took DES, the guys in wildlife who were looking at the alligators and frogs are going, wait a minute, we're finding exactly the same thing in our frogs. We're finding the same effects in our alligators. And we're trying to figure out why the alligators are becoming infertile. And then they're looking at the pesticide levels in the alligators and going, oh my God, it's correlating that these organochloride pesticides are actually acting as endocrine disrupting chemicals. And that's when they made the connection. What was happening in the wildlife could actually start be happening in human epidemiological studies. They then developed a wonderful statement about what needs to be done, and of course nothing's happened since then on a legislative level in any country. In the 1970s and 80s, Frederick vom Saal. Now, you probably know vom Saal's work because he was the first one to indicate the concern associated with bisphenol A. Is everyone familiar with BPA? BPA is one out of 1,000 endocrine disrupting chemicals that are now in commercial use. His research is very interesting on mice because he very accidentally started to look at the impact of xenoestrogen on his mice. And he discovered that male mice exposed to estrogen in the womb actually increased the male sexual activity later on in adult life. They were more likely to be very poor fathers and increased the risk of infanticide, killing their own young, and they had much larger prostate glands because the receptors were not as exposed to as much testosterone. That in fact exposure to estrogen in the womb could make males more aggressive as adults, which challenged our thinking: testosterone, male behaviour, aggression. In fact, his research was saying the opposite. According to vom Saal, high testosterone mice made much better fathers. And with mice, basically the way it happens is they have little pouches. So when a mouse is pregnant, she could have 10, 15 young, for example. So they're all in these little pouches. So when the male mice are in between two other male mice, they're washed with testosterone. And that could influence their behaviour in adult life. But if a male was between two female mice in the utero, they were more likely to be aggressive in adulthood and more likely to be poorer fathers, more likely to kill their young because they were washed with estrogen. What was really interesting about his study is that he found that female mice who were between two female womb mates had a 60% chance of having female children themselves. So we assume that if you're a double X, you're a female, if you're an XY, you're a male. He's saying in the thousands of mice that he did that if that female in the mother was between two other females, the chances she would have female mice herself was 60%. It wasn't a 50-50. Which starts to think that maybe the environment could influence what type of sex you have based on what you're exposed to in the utero. It brings up all interesting questions for twins. I had fraternal twins. One's a boy, one's a girl. So it's interesting, whether Flynn was washed with more estrogen from Sydney and vice versa, her more testosterone. We don't know. I could only find one study on starting to look at this based on what he was finding in his mice studies. Female mice who had male womb mates were far more aggressive and give birth to male offspring later on in life, a 60% chance of having males. So that what she was exposed to when she was wedged between two males was more testosterone in utero, and that influenced the percentage chance of having more males as a result of her progeny. The placenta protects the baby from harmful substances. Here are the medical assumptions we made that, of course, we now know are false. The placenta protects the baby from harmful substances. DES was the first time we started looking at this and going, no, it doesn't. And thalidomide, of course, was horrific in terms of the amount of stillborns, but also defective children that were born without limbs, etc., and phycomelia, etc. This is when we discovered that what a woman takes during pregnancy could have massive implications on the offspring. The second assumption was the studies on rats don't reflect what happens in humans. In fact, we now know this isn't true. In some cases it is, but when it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, what happens in rats in my studies is starting to reflect what's happening in terms of the epidemiology of human diseases like breast cancer and early puberty and hypospadia, etc. If it didn't cause symptoms in adults, it won't affect the fetus. And of course we know that is not true, that there are in fact transgenerational effects, which are a real problem. And how do you monitor that? So essentially what we're saying is that with endocrine disrupting chemicals, the latency periods are generations. Asbestos was 37 years. We're talking a generation. What shocked me, and I don't remember learning about this when I went to uni, was that up until 7 weeks, the embryo goes through a bipotential stage. Human embryos are programmed to become female. Human embryos retain their potential to be either a male or a female up until 7 weeks. They develop a pair of unisex gonads that can become either testicles or ovaries, and 2 sets of primitive plumbing: the Wolvian ducts, the male reproductive tract, and the Mullerian ducts, the female reproductive tract. So what happens at week 7, that a gene, the STRI gene on the Y chromosome, sends a message to that embryo, XY, and what it does if it sends that message to the XY embryo, it gets the embryo to develop testicles. Those testicles then produce testosterone, which make the male brain, that embryo, a male brain, and then stimulate the development of the male reproductive tract. That testosterone, it also secretes anti-Mullerian duct hormone at 7 weeks. So the XY embryo will secrete anti-Mullerian duct hormone, which will shut down and diminish and shrivel up the female reproductive tract. If that message does not happen between week 7 and 14, that embryo will develop into a female phenotype. Swyer syndrome affects 1 in 30,000 births. Basically, they are female phenotypes who, when they get up to wanting to have kids, they can't have children. They go to IVF and they go, oh my God, you're a male. You have X46XY is your genotype. You have a female reproductive tract, but you have no ovaries. You have breasts, you are a female, you think female, you didn't even know you were male. But you have an XY chromosome in every cell of your body. Swyer syndrome. So this was something that shocked me. Embryos are geared to becoming females unless the gene on that Y chromosome at week 7 sends a message to the XY embryo, which isn't male or female yet, to shrivel up the female reproductive tract in that embryo and to produce testosterone to make the male male. Imagine as the body burden of xenoestrogen continues in our society, the ramifications this has. And the interest from my perspective is that Danish researchers have found much higher levels. There's been a 400% increase in undescended testes, or cryptorchidism. There've been, a 2% increase in every year in the last 20 years in Australia for hypospadias. Interesting. An increase in undescended testicles is a very high risk factor for infertility in males and testicular cancer. Testicular cancer has increased 400%. And what they found is that when they took out the cells from men with testicular cancer, they found cells that resembled what they would find in a male fetus, as if those cells had never differentiated beyond the fetal stage. That something had triggered the cells within the testicles to stop maturing. And this is an interesting thing because of the increase in testicular cancer. The Danish researchers are going, these cells have not differentiated beyond what should have happened in the fetus. They haven't. And these men have high rates of testicular cancer. What is affecting the development of these cells in utero that is having ramifications of increased risks of these deformities in young males, but more importantly, the testicular cancer later on in life? This is a brilliant website by the Endocrine Disruption Exchange. Basically, when you go to the website, you click on one of those numbers. So, for example, number 1, it'll tell you a study, in vivo or in vitro, that relates to, at the first week of pregnancy, what happens to the ovaries and eggs in the female reproductive tract. So as you click along and you put your pointer on each of these numbers, it relates to a study that has been done at that stage of the trimester of the pregnancy, normally of mice, but there are some human studies as well, and what impact these chemicals had. So when they gave bisphenol A, which is the brown slide, what studies on BPA at which stages of the pregnancy affect, what impact it had on the ovaries and eggs, on the duct system and the vagina, on the breast development. So it's well worth going to this particular website because it gives you a very good idea as to the critical windows of development, which is fundamental to understanding the impact of endocrine disrupting chemicals on our bodies. And the other one, of course, is phthalates, which I'll go into. There's been a significant increase in endocrine-related disorders according to the World Health Organization. They developed a report, the state of the art of endocrine disrupting chemicals, in 2012. It's about 300 pages long, and you read it and go, as a species, we're buggered. You know, even coming from the World Health Organization, who, you know, in terms of electromagnetic fields, there's a lot more they can do. But, you know, when it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals, even they're worried, and you can see why. They've indicated that an increase in endocrine-related disorders, genital malformations, I've mentioned undescended testicles. This has increased 2% every year in Australia between 1980 and 2000, an increase of 2% every year in Australia alone in young boys. And as I said, that is a risk factor for testicular cancer and infertility in males. Hypospadias, where the urethral meatus is found on the ventral side of the penis. That is increasing quite significantly also. And of course we know DES, diethylstilbestrol, polybrominated diphenyl ethers, flame retardants, and pesticides have been directly linked with the development of hypospadias. Declining sperm counts. When the Danish first indicated several years ago that sperm count had dropped by 50% in the last 50 years, researchers were so shocked that they tried to dismiss the claims. That is until the US got involved and started to look at the research, and the French had a data bank of sperm count from the 1960s and 70s, and they kept very good records of sperm counts at that time in Parisian men. So they said, look, we can compare the data to see what's happened. And when they looked at the data, they found that there was a drop from 113 sperm per mil compared to now 66 million sperm per mil. That there'd been a 50% decline, i.e. sperm count has declined by 1% every year for the last 50 years. And of course that's have massive repercussions for fertility. Breast cancer. We know, of course, with breast cancer, in the 1960s it was 1 in 20 women who had it. And when I was teaching as a naturopath, I was fortunate, I've taught over 2,000 naturopaths when I was lecturing at university for 12 years, many years ago. And I had a few women who worked in oncology wards who would come up to me and say, you know, in the 1960s and 70s, when I was working at the Austin Hospital, if a woman in her 20s came into the department, the entire department knew about it in half an hour because it was so rare. She said now women in their 20s, you know, there's loads of them coming into the department. What on earth is going on? The incidence of breast cancer now is 1 in 8 in Australian women. And of course that is increasing all the time, and we're at a loss to determine why this is the case. Now in my book I talk a lot about the pink washing. Because I self-publish, I can say whatever I like. The pink washing about cosmetic companies giving funds to breast cancer research when their products are actually potentially causing it. You know, this goes on all the time. Great, they give research, but you know, let's start looking at what the heck you're giving women in the first place that could be increasing their risk for breast cancer in the first place. PCBs, dioxins and pesticides, of course, have been directly linked to increased risk of breast cancer. Endometrial, ovarian and prostate cancers related to these types of environmental contaminants, including arsenic. And of course, testicular and thyroid related disorders related to phthalates as well as pesticides, according to the European Union and the World Health Organization. A significant increase in endocrine-related disorders relate to early puberty. In the early 1900s, the average age of menarche was 16. Now in Australia it's 12. In African American girls it's 8. 50% will start at the age of 8, African American girls. Many girls starting now as young as 7 and 8. Now when I went through primary school, there was one locked door in the toilets. And I remember one girl in the whole school who had her period, I didn't know that at the time, who used this key to get in there. I think, what the hell is in her toilet? She needs a key to get in there. And it was a sanitary bin, obviously. I didn't even know until later on. One. Now, think about how many girls start puberty in primary school. Quite a lot. What we know, risk factors for early puberty are better nutrition can bring on puberty. Yeah. Childhood obesity. What interests me about childhood obesity is that childhood obesity can be directly related to endocrine disrupting chemicals. Why? Because infant obesity has increased by 70%. Infant obesity. I'm talking about in infants who haven't even touched food yet, who are breastfed, who haven't even drunk anything external apart from their breast milk. When you have infant obesity increasing to such a degree, you know something else is going on apart from what's going on in their mouth. Bruce Blumberg from the University of California has coined the term in 2006 obesogens, chemicals that make kids fat that have nothing to do with what they eat or drink. And it happens in utero. What happened in the 80s, and this is when the breast cancer risks increased from 5,300 women in 1982 in Australia to 15,500 due to have breast cancer now in Australia. In that time, I look at what happened and we introduced polycarbonate baby bottles. We introduced a hell of a lot more xenoestrogens into our everyday household products. So obesity and obesogens is an interesting term, chemicals that make kids fat. And what I suspect is happening is that when you increase the body burden of these chemicals, the way the body deals with it to protect the vital organs is to shunt it into the fat. So maybe obesity is a protective mechanism to shunt chemicals, toxic chemicals, into the fat stores so it's not going through the brain and through all the other vital organs. I've only seen very little research on it, but it's one worth pursuing. That when people lose weight, that's when biochemical nutrition is so critical, because you get it back into the systemic circulation where it can do a hell of a lot more damage. So it's very important that the proper chelating factors are used, the proper nutrition to support phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification are required, to support elimination, hydration, skin detoxing, all the Ayurvedic stuff, really important to make sure that this is going to, if it comes out of the fat tissue as they're losing weight, it's being excreted so it's not getting back into the systemic circulation through the blood-brain barrier and causing all sorts of things again. So I think obesity is something could be environmentally related to some degree. The fact that infant obesity is increased makes me think there's definitely something going on that's beyond nutrition. Type 2 diabetes is on the increase. Widespread infertility. Widespread infertility varies depending on which country you're looking at. Anything from 9% to 20% of Western couples are having some degree of infertility issue. It's almost like IVF is the place. I'm sure my kids will grow up and go, oh, IVF is the place where you go and have kids, because we can't do it anymore. What a sad state to society when that happens. Retarded neurobehavioural development, and we'll talk a bit about this as we go into hormone disrupting chemicals. Low level exposure to synthetic or xenoestrogens or environmental estrogens during adulthood may not have dramatic effects on females. In fact, it rarely does. This is why we never saw the connection in the women who took DES. However, when the exposure occurs in utero during critical windows of development, it can have significant and lasting effects on the development of the female reproductive tract and the mammary gland. And how do you prevent that after it's already happened? That's what worries me about EDCs. 2 to 9% of newborns have undescended testicles, mimicking well-established data on increasing trends in testicular cancer arising during fetal origin. How do you prevent that once that's happened and that baby is born? The speed with which the increase in these diseases, these endocrine-related diseases, has occurred in recent decades completely rules out genetics as the sole plausible explanation. So endocrine disrupting chemicals affect 3 hormone pathways: the estrogen signalling pathway, the androgen signalling pathway, and the thyroid. Women exposed to high levels of BPA early in their pregnancy had an 83% greater risk of miscarriage than women with the lowest levels. And the thing with BPA is that it has a very short half-life of about 24 hours. So it's only in the system for a very short period of time. The fact that they found it in over 90% of Australian women and over 90% of the US women shows how ubiquitous it is through the environment. And that's why I brought all this stuff. Believe it or not, I put this in my luggage from Melbourne. We have...
You're not taking it back, though, are you?
I'm not taking this back. No way. We have organic coconut milk lined with BPA. You know, this epoxy resin that is used in our tin food that, according to Food Standards Australia, is acceptable because it's at low levels. And I'll talk about non-monotonic dose responses and why EDCs are the most dangerous at the lowest levels. So we have BPA lining most of our food tins. Isn't it interesting? Japan phased out epoxy resin lined BPA in 1998 from its food tins, but we're not even having this discussion in Food Standards Australia, are we? We have polystyrene, and I'll go through a few of these because I'm going to teach you how to read what plastic it is so you can identify what you need to avoid and what your patients need to avoid, because the industry and manufacturing industry is very fickle. My husband and I sold our house to create a cleaning product range for kids with chemical sensitivities. It's a Bode, and it's in health food store lines, and basically it's for people with skin and allergies, etc. I was shocked as an Australian manufacturer that Nick Nass didn't really give a rat's razoo what I put in my product, because there's virtually no regulation. And I'm going to talk about the inadequacies of regulation of chemicals in this country because it's appalling, and this is why I'm talking about this topic today. Individual endocrine disrupting chemicals are unlikely to cause breast cancer cells to grow in culture, but pronounced proliferation occurs of breast cancer cells when multiple endocrine disrupting chemicals are given together at the same time. And I can tell you, all of you have multiple endocrine disrupting chemicals sitting in your fat tissue right now that you have inherited from your parents. And let's face it, I'm a 60s baby, so, you know, I had more pesticide level exposure in my generation than any other generation in humankind, because DDT was everywhere, of course, in the market gardens, etc. So the 60s babies had the most levels of pesticide exposure. Only a very small fraction of the almost 1,000 potential endocrine disrupting chemicals on the market have actually ever been investigated. Tiny amounts. As I said, 80 to 90% of all the chemicals in our everyday products, our shampoos, conditioners, moisturisers, perfumes, has ever been tested for its impact on human health. Why? Because a manufacturer and supplier are not required to prove safety before they bring it to market. And I think most consumers would be shocked by that, because when they go to the Telstra shop, someone would have checked the radiation from that level. I know I've already talked about EMFs yesterday, but I have to bring it in, because EMFs increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. So if you have a mother using iPads, iPhones, etc., laptops on wireless mode, and she's using body butter full of perfume that have endocrine disrupting chemicals, you drive that into the through the blood-brain barrier much more quickly. And I think this is the problem with environmental health, is that we're not looking at the synergistic effect of radio frequencies increasing blood-brain barriers, heavy metal exposures, because 3.6 million homes in Australia still have 50% lead content in their walls of their paint. We are not looking at the synergistic effect of all of these things. And then we wonder why ADH is skyrocketing, why autism continues to increase, why hyperactivity is an issue, why puberty is dropping, and all of these other issues. I think you don't need to be a brain surgeon to realise that the environment is playing a significant role in a lot of these disorders. So we have two types of endocrine disrupting chemicals. We have persistent EDCs. Most are persistent organic pollutants. Many have been banned through the Stockholm Convention, which is a good thing. However, most of them you'll still find in your blood and your fat tissue, because that's how persistent they are. That's the difference between phytoestrogens and xenoestrogens. Phytoestrogens have short half-lives. Persistent endocrine disrupting chemicals stay for decades in your fat tissue. And that is a big difference. They have a very long half-life, they accumulate in adipose tissue, and therefore polychlorinated biphenyls in industrial solvents and fluids, flame retardants and perfluorinated compounds found in your non-stick cookware, etc., are persistent. They stay in your body for a long time. DuPont have been forced to phase out non-stick cookware or perfluorinated chemicals from their non-stick cookware, but they're giving a year, I think 2015, where they'll phase it out, but they aren't doing it at the moment. That's because of pressure, because it's in everyone's blood. Every adult blood that's been tested has these chemicals in them, because it's so ubiquitous throughout our environments. The non-persistent endocrine disrupting chemicals, of which over 5 million tonnes are produced annually around in Western countries, are found in household products, including phthalates. Phthalates are mainly in plastics, and they're often in your perfume. If there's one thing that my students, that I ask them in the student handbook to do, is when they come to our classes, never wear perfume. Perfume is the worst of the worst. Because of industry secrecy laws, the manufacturer is not required to tell you what petrochemicals are in those perfumes, and if they did, they'd probably give you a 4-page handbook with every perfume they sold, because that's how many chemicals are in it. They have loaded with phthalates. Most of them, at least 70 to 80% of perfumes that have been tested by the Environmental Working Group in the States have phthalates in them. So perfume, and think about where perfume is. Your aftershave, anything that says fragrance, anything that says puffer or fragrance or perfume is a disaster for human health. It needs to be avoided. Now, I know Italy and France are now trying to develop phthalate-free perfumes. They're not on the market yet. But quite frankly, stick with your essential oils, or, don't have any perfume. Pregnant women should not have perfume.
I mean, even essential oils, they come from the same barrel, so they're full of pesticides. So you have to be very careful which company you go with. And there's only a couple of companies that are doing it without pesticides and using steam distillation to actually produce them.
That's right, yes. And look, even essential oils, I'd say, for pregnant women should be avoided. Essential oils in children and pregnant women should be avoided altogether. People think it's natural. Yes, so is asbestos, so is uranium, that's natural. We need to start thinking about why children are uniquely susceptible, and that essential oils are toxic at certain doses. There are 47 known biogenic or naturally occurring endocrine disrupting chemicals, or phytoestrogens are one of them. And then, of course, you're all familiar with that, the isoflavones and your soybeans, etc. Your lignans are the important ones, with your fibre-containing phytoestrogens. Your monophenols, your mycotoxins, mould actually creates endocrine disrupting chemicals, and phenolic acids. The synthetic sources of endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's actually a list you can find of all of these chemicals, and it reads like a lot of them are petrochemicals, and there's just pages and pages and pages where they list all 149 endocrine disrupting chemicals in household products, 93 in cosmetics. Flame retardants have 39, and this is all what they've counted to date. Of course, list is always increasing. 42 endocrine disrupting chemicals in food additives. A lot of these are in the plastics. Pesticides, of course, have the highest number of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Even some of the organophosphates are coming up as an issue. Plastic and rubber, 127. Antimicrobial, your triclosan, which is banned in Canada, in many parts of Europe. We use it as antibacterial washes in our schools, for goodness sake. I say to my kids, don't touch it. Just put your hands in the dirt. That's going to be a hell of a lot healthier than using triclosan, which targets the thyroid, causing thyroid disruption. How can we allow chemicals still in this country that is being banned in other countries? And this is what shocks me when, I put my courses together and I write the book and I go, this is crazy that we're not talking about this when I look at what other progressive countries are doing about these issues. So what I want to do is look at the resin identification code in plastics. Plastics are going to be one of the top sources of endocrine disrupting chemicals you're going to find in the market. So what you need to do is to actually start reading labels. And with plastics, you're going to find a triangle like this on most plastics, unless it's Tupperware. And I'm not ashamed to say this on film either. Tupperware are not open about what plastic and resins they use. I rang them 3 times before I went on Sunrise Channel 7 to talk about plastics, because they had a woman who had a plastic allergy, an anaphylactic reaction to plastics, and they wanted me to comment about plastics. So I rang them up 3 times and, oh yeah, we'll get back to you, never did. And I talked to the girls who were selling all this stuff. They don't have no idea. It's important they don't have any idea, otherwise they wouldn't sell it, would they? If people knew what a safety data sheet was, they probably wouldn't sell half the cosmetics that they do on those multi-level marketing things. Not that I'm going to mention brands. So if you have a look at the resin identification code, you will find them on your plastic packaging. So the big ones are, and I'll just pass some around. I want you to have a look at what this is in our plastics. Let's have a look at what this all means. Plastics. 1, polyethylene terephthalate. Raw PET is not an endocrine disrupting chemical. But because it's the most recyclable plastic in the world, it is used in 99% of all your water bottles. So if you have a look at the water bottles, Mount Franklin, or any of your water bottles, they'll have a number 1 resin identification code. Some people call this the recycling code because the resin tells you whether it's recyclable or not, basically. Yeah, its correct term is resin identification code because it tells us the dominant resin. So 1 is polyethylene terephthalate. Raw PET is not an endocrine disrupting chemical, but because it's the most recyclable plastic in the world, recycled PET in animal studies have been shown to have endocrine disrupting effects, because if it was recycled from a shampoo that had a fragrance in it, that fragrance, when they melted the plastic, ended up embedding itself into that PET plastic. So this is where the studies are coming up as, oh my gosh, sometimes we're getting endocrine disrupting effects in this PET when it shouldn't have because it was recycled. How do you know that water bottle's been recycled or not? You don't. Now sadly only 13% is recycled in Australia in the last statistics, which means most goes to landfill, which sort of defeats the purpose of having a recycled plastic. What's really important is to go back to basics. Glass. Get a Grolsch beer bottle, with the flip lid. Beer's not too bad either. And drink that. Use that as your reusable bottle. For children, my kids are 7, twins at school, so they use stainless steel bottles. So, start with your glass baby bottles. And people go, oh, but it breaks. Yeah, glass breaks. You buy another one. I mean, what's the big deal? My mum did that when I was, an infant. Glass is the only option, especially for babies, because you can imagine as they go through critical windows of development in those first 12 months, that their susceptibility to BPA in polycarbonate plastic bottles is enormous. Their whole diet is breast milk or infant formula and BPA. And this is the first generation to come through, which coincides with early puberty, increased risk of breast cancers, etc. I don't think this is a coincidence. Number 3, a disaster. The worst building material we ever brought into the house apart from asbestos was PVC. Interesting, the studies of women who live in homes that have vinyl flooring and breast cancer rates. Because PVC contains phthalates, diethylhexyl phthalate. There are over 20 phthalates, but DEHP is the major phthalate used in PVC. They used to use lead stabilisers in PVC as well, which is why PVC in tank water is a huge problem too. Having PVC pipe from the roof catchment area to your tank water in the open sun, because all plastics degrade with time, is not a good idea. So PVC is a big no. PVC, children's toys, shower curtains, vinyl flooring is an absolute, has no place for me as a building biologist. It should not be in our homes, and it certainly shouldn't be anywhere near children's mouths who are teething. So PVC is a big problem because of the phthalate issue. Polystyrene. This is the plastic that was used in the test tubes with Soto and Sonnenschein's research. It was a nonylphenol in the polystyrene plastic that was causing the breast cancer cells to multiply. So polystyrene trays. Isn't it interesting? Every time I go to the butcher, if you go to the big supermarkets, they have the polystyrene trays with acidic meat.
They're black now.
Yeah.
I've never noticed that.
Yeah. Exactly. Still polystyrene, aren't they? That's a real problem because meat is acidic, it's more likely to react, that's an issue. So I'd suggest you go to a conventional butcher. I don't even know if people know what a butcher looks like nowadays. I prefer to shop at a real butcher, at a real greengrocer who's just gone to the market 2 o'clock that morning to pick it up, so I know my veggies aren't more than 24 hours old, and do my shopping that way as much as I can. Because the best advice I can give after teaching nutrition for a long time at uni is avoid packaged food. There's a lot of nutrition, but packaged food, if we can get rid of the packaged food, we can get rid of a lot of these issues, and we can improve people's health significantly.
I think CSIRO says that 75% of food eaten in Australia is packaged food. So that's the statistic.
Wow.
Yeah.
75%.
75% of food is packaged foods that we're eating.
Yeah, and look, you can see the ramifications of that.
I went to Coles the other day.
Yes.
Got organic zucchini in a polystyrene bottle wrapped in glad wrap.
Yeah.
I prefer conventional. Now, the beauty with the zucchini, it's less likely to react. Because it's, if I had nuts, etc., it's not going to react to the polystyrene. But the fact is you have to put it somewhere, waste it, put incineration, burn it, release dioxins at the same time. That releases a whole other issue of air quality. Of course, mincemeat, big issue because it's acidic, isn't it? That is a big no. No. Get it in paper, or even your plastic bags that you have for your vegetables, etc., from a lot of greengrocer places. That's HDPE and low-density polyethylene. So that's a non-endocrine disrupting chemical. Or bring stuff for the butcher to put it on when you go to the butcher. That would be even better.
There's a juice company, famous multi-chain juice company, that put out their juices, which are freshly squeezed and just down there into polystyrene. Yeah. And they also released a statement saying why they chose polystyrene, saying that it was environmentally their lowest impact. And I thought,
It was ridiculous. Especially because of the amount of research since 1989 on breast cancer rates, etc. I mean, that's ridiculous. Polystyrene. Yeah.
I just don't understand how she made that call.
She probably made assumptions like most consumers do. It's on the market, it must be safe, someone would have checked it. Consumer myth number 1.
It won't be the boost sales.
We're not mentioning names. Number 7 is every other plastic that doesn't fit into those other categories. This is where polycarbonate fits in. Other, O for other, yep. I've never seen O actually on there, it just says number 7. But that's other as in everything. And that includes your plant-based plastics as well, your biodegradable plant-based plastics, but it does include polycarbonate, which is the monomer used in polycarbonate is BPA. So I would avoid number 7 just because I don't know what is in it. It could be BPA, it may not. So the top ones are the ones to avoid. The bottom ones are the ones that are non-endocrine disrupting, but they're plastics and they degrade in sunlight and in natural light. And of course, plastics are a disaster for the garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean and marine wildlife, etc. So I think we need to get away from plastics. But high density polyethylene and low density polyethylene typically used in a lot of your bottles for milk, orange juice, ice cream containers. Your shopping bags tend to be LDPE. Tend to use this one. Polypropylene, again, is a non-endocrine disrupting chemical. It's often used in sippy cups and things like that nowadays, and producers are going towards that. Other producers are going to PES, or polyethylene sulfone, which is another type of plastic, as a BPA alternative. But I just want to make a comment about BPA, which we'll show in a slide in a minute, that 90% of all the products tested that were marketed as BPA free showed estrogenic activity that was equal or worse than BPA.
What's the percentage?
90%. According to Yang, and there was another study after that, a year later, that confirmed that also. Why? Because the manufacturers went, oh, public doesn't want to buy BPA, they're getting a bit savvy thanks to social media, so we'll take out the monomer and we'll put in bisphenol S instead. Bisphenol S has been shown to be worse estrogenic activity in animal studies than even BPA was. But because they can say BPA free, it's BPS, so it's BPA free. Because what people don't understand is manufacturers and suppliers can put whatever they want in their product, and because consumers didn't want BPA, they're going to do something else. So they'll add a different chemical or monomer instead. And a lot of the monomers they're using is bisphenol S from the same family of chemicals. So this is why I say go back to glass, go back to stainless steel, go back to ceramic, go back, of course, as long as it's not lead lined, porcelain, Corning ware, Pyrex. Go back to what we did in the 60s, pretty much. Fiberglass. They have a lot of resins in fiberglass and glues that can be toxic as it's outgassing when they first make it. So not as a food storage vessel, I wouldn't use fiberglass.
Coffee cups go and they look ugly after a while.
So can you all see from the numbers there that there is a number on those packaging? Could you find them? Some of them are a bit hard to find, but you can see that there are numbers. Now, the problem with plastics that I didn't mention, because that wasn't enough, is that that's the dominant plastic. They add other chemicals to the plastic that they don't have to state on the resin identification code. How do I know? Because Mark and I were looking at developing a bottle range that was estrogenic activity free, EA free. This is the term that should be used in the general market, not BPA free, it should be EA free, estrogenic activity free. Now, no one's cottoned on to that yet, but it should be EA free. So when we looked at developing our own bottles, we couldn't find any manufacturers in Australia, so we asked a couple of suppliers in China who probably mould most of the bottles around the world, and they said, I said, well, we only want polypropylene, and they said, well, we're going to add these other chemicals to make it heat resistant, so it's it's not going to split when you drop it, etc. And I said, I don't want that. And I said, well, that's standard practice, that we add these other chemicals apart from the main resin identification code number. So that sort of shocked me.
What determines what they have to disclose and what they don't have to disclose?
No, they don't have to disclose anything. I think half the people who buy the plastics from China assume that it's only that resin, because they probably never ask enough questions. With the Chinese, it's in dealing with the Asian market for the last 20 years, if you don't ask the question, they don't give you the answer. So you have to ask a lot of questions to the suppliers because they're not freely giving in their answers. Just a cultural thing, I think, with Asia. So you have to be very specific about what you do and don't want in your product if you're getting things from China particularly. Number of endocrine disrupting chemicals on the market in the medical and veterinary industry, research 241. This would include a lot of your pharmaceutical drugs, of course, oral contraceptive pill. The metal industry, these metals are endocrine disrupting chemicals. Cadmium, mercury, arsenic, lead, manganese. Solvents, industrial additives, byproducts as a reaction, and metabolites. The total amount of phthalate contained in a toy product varies from 10 to 50% depending on the degree of softness required according to our ACCC. That's a hell of a lot of phthalates. So what is the difference between natural endogenous from estradiol in our bodies and phytoestrogens versus the synthetic environmental estrogens. And this is something that's really important because, as we saw with Mona's talk, phytoestrogens can have a protective effect. They probably don't have as much a role in infant formula and soy formula, and I'm sure we'll all agree the isoflavones are not a good source of phytoestrogens. This is where they differ. The endogenous estrogens within our body and the phytoestrogens are much easier to break down, having half-lives within 24 hours. The xenoestrogens, particularly the persistent ones, the POPs, the persistent organic pollutants, last for the rest of your life in some cases, years and years and years in your lipids. Estradiol has a greater binding affinity for nuclear estrogen receptor, which is important, whereas xenoestrogens will bind to membrane receptors, and this becomes important when you're pregnant. The reason is because a greater binding affinity happens with endogenous estrogens when you're pregnant. So when a woman is pregnant, the body automatically, the plasma proteins bind to these estrogens to protect the fetus from high levels of estrogens. It does this naturally. Xenoestrogens do not bind to these plasma proteins very well. So the xenoestrogens remain free in the circulation while the woman is pregnant and attached to the receptor sites within the fetus in their gonads that can have repercussions down the track. Now, the big thing that they've learnt about all of these xenoestrogens is that estrogen is a very promiscuous receptor. She ain't fussy. You know, that lock and key mechanism is another medical myth. This drug, this receptor, when it comes to estrogen, she will welcome the neighbours because she will allow BPA to attach to her, she'll allow the phthalates, and you look at those organic chemicals and you go, oh my God, there's not even, structurally they're not even similar. But estrogen receptor is incredibly promiscuous. Hundreds of chemicals potentially can bind to her receptor sites, and this is the problem. So in pregnancy, the natural endogenous estrogens and the phytoestrogens tend to bind to these plasma proteins and protect the fetus from high levels of estrogen at certain stages of the pregnancy. Remarkable. One thing you learn when you learn anatomy and physiology is how remarkable the body is at tolerating so much stuff that we give it in our lifetime. But there is a threshold. Unfortunately, in utero, this threshold happens early on. These xenoestrogens don't bind to these plasma proteins, so the fetus, the embryo, is exposed to estrogens that would never have happened in our grandparents' time. In addition, they act additively with endogenous estrogens, causing biological effects at extremely low levels at parts per trillion. So what have we learnt? Lab animals exposed to a single chemical at a well-defined developmental stage. This is how we research chemicals. We give this rat or mouse this amount of chemicals until we get to the LD50, lethal dose 50, where 50% of the test animals die. And most of the time we exterminate the 50% that survive, so we never know the long-term ramifications of that chemical on that rat's life or their offspring. Most of the safety data sheets we have for chemicals, pesticides, building materials, household products, perfumes, etc., are based on an LD50, an acute effect of that chemical at high levels. It doesn't tell you the long-term effect on those animals at low levels, which is typically what happens with you and I and our children over a lifetime. So the way we look at chemical testing is very limited. It's often geared to the acute effects, not the chronic effects. Conventional testing doesn't reflect real-life scenario. Humans contain small concentrations of high numbers of EDCs at levels known to cause endocrine disruption. What we rely on is epidemiological studies. Let's wait till the clusters occur, and then we're going to look back retrospectively and try and figure out what the hell happened. This is ridiculous. Because the focus is not on the precautionary principle. It's focused on manufacturers can do whatever they like because they don't have to prove safety. We'll wait till the disease happens in the human population and then we'll look back retrospectively. Now, if you explain that to a normal, healthy adult, they'll go, that's ridiculous. And I'm going, yeah, but that's what happens in our regulatory society. That's what happens in most Western countries. We made an assumption with chemicals that the dose makes the poison. Of course, Paracelsus is the father of toxicology. The higher the level given to an adult of that chemical, the greater the response and the more the adverse health effects. Even water can kill you if you drink too much. Yep, we all know, based on Paracelsus' theory, that the dose makes the poison. That does not happen with endocrine disrupting chemicals, and this is why it is such a dilemma for the scientific community to try and understand how to regulate these chemicals. There are now draft documents by the National Academy in Europe trying to figure out a way to even research how to determine the lowest level exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, because the existing model to test chemicals, i.e. the dose makes a poison, that linear dose response is not adequate when it comes to endocrine disrupting chemicals. We know it's not the dose, but the timing and the duration of exposure during critical windows of development, particularly in the fetus, that makes them so harmful to fetuses particularly. And the ramification of that isn't seen until later on in life. So we have the monotonic curves, which is how most chemicals occur. So the higher the level of the chemical given, the greater the response and the adverse health effects. Endocrine disrupting chemicals do this. They follow non-monotonic curves. And most of them do this one here, which is the greater, the lower the level of exposure, the worse the impact. Can you see that? So this is the level of the chemical. The lower the level of exposure, the greater the impact on the body. As you increase the level of that endocrine disrupting chemical, it causes down cell regulation where the receptors don't respond to that endocrine disrupting chemical. It responds at low levels. Why? Think about your endogenous hormones. What parts per million, parts per trillion do they act in the body, don't they? Estradiol is a very potent hormone, endogenous hormone. It acts in parts per trillion. Well, the body doesn't go, all right, you're my natural hormone. It doesn't differentiate between a BPA and a phthalate and estradiol, because she's going to accept anybody, isn't she? And they act in parts per trillion. So the lower the level of exposure to these chemicals, the greater the response. In fact, ironically, if Food Standards Australia is going to regulate plastic packaging, it should put a hell of a lot more levels of phthalates in it so that you're less likely to respond. As ridiculous as that sounds, based on the way we know endocrine disrupting chemicals work. So the chemical regulation does not look at synergistic effect. I looked at, I talked about EMFs yesterday. The fact that they increase the permeability of the blood-brain barrier is a huge concern, because then you start allowing all these other things straight into the central nervous system. I don't see studies looking at EMFs and radio frequencies and wireless technology and heavy metals or endocrine disrupting chemicals or chemicals we know that can have adverse health effects in an unborn child or in children generally. It doesn't look at additive effects. The way we currently look at chemicals is go this chemical to this rat to the LD50, and that's about it. The rest is sort of relying on human studies, diseases in the human population. So we are the canaries in the mine. It doesn't look at transgenerational effects. Until you get people like Von Saal looking at his rats and thousands of rats going and looking at the transgenerational effects of these chemicals, that they're showing not just in the offspring, they're actually showing in their offspring, in the grandchildren. And of course it makes sense, because if you have an endocrine disrupting chemical and the fetus is in there, it's already got its gonads there, developing from 7 weeks onwards. So it's going to be affected also by those chemicals and have transgenerational effects. LD50 only looks at acute effects. Critical windows of development are often ignored. Self-regulated. As I said, manufacturers and suppliers are not required to prove safety. Carcinogens are currently the only chemicals that are toxicologically defined with zero tolerance. I think we need to look at the way we regulate chemicals and say endocrine disrupting chemicals are zero tolerance, because there's no other way around this. Traditional toxicity testing is inadequate to determine the chemical safety of EDCs, which can act at levels as a tenth of a trillionth of a gram. To give you an idea of how small this is 1 second in 3,169 centuries is which a hormone can act in the body. 1 drop of gin in a train 100 kilometres long of tonic. The regulatory system works on the premise that until there's solid scientific evidence that an agent can cause harm, it's assumed to be safe. That's ridiculous. So therefore we allow chemicals and things like asbestos, leaded petrol, PVC, tobacco to stay on the market for decades. The regulation of chemicals in Australia involves multiple organisations having limited powers and inadequate budgets to even regulate chemicals. This is a problem. They're slow to respond to emerging science, and they often rely on international data to make conclusions before they look at it. NICNAS is our major or regulatory authority, Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, National Drugs and Poison Schedule, Food Standards Australia, and Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Board, the Australian Building Code, Therapeutics Goods Act, and Australian Building Codes Board. They're our regulatory organisation. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute of how they don't regulate chemicals and endocrine disrupting chemicals. BPA-free products made from these chemicals, leached chemicals, estrogenic activity. So these are BPA-free products that are marketed, and yet they show estrogenic activity. How Australia compares to other countries. In the USA, they restricted in 2008 6 phthalates. Canada banned BPA in 2009. We still haven't banned BPA. It's just been voluntarily taken out by our retailers. Denmark bans 4 phthalates, but because of pressure from the European Union on free trade agreements, they were forced not to ban those 4 chemicals. Australia, after looking at 9 phthalates that they said is a priority existing chemical, that they said these are phthalates that we're really worried about, after all their research from 2006, all they did at the end of all of that was to reduce and restrict the amount of DEHP, diethylhexylphthalate, from children's toys. That was it. European Commission, REACH program, brilliant, has now looking at 30,000 chemicals and trying to regulate them into the European Union. So you find a lot of chemicals that are not in the European Union that are allowed in Australia because we don't have the same type of testing. I'm rushing now because I'm running out of time. Exposure to EDCs during fetal development and puberty plays a role in the increased incidences of reproductive diseases, endocrine-related cancers, behavioural and learning problems, including ADHD, infections, asthma, and perhaps obesity and diabetes, according to the World Health Organisation. Ironically, and this is the one that really worries me most, the most efficient way to reduce your body load and body burden of endocrine disrupting chemicals is to get pregnant and give it to your fetus, is to actually breastfeed and give it to the newborn child. As I've indicated before, the most effective way to determine how toxic our environment has become is to check the breast milk, because babies are at the very end of the food chain. And this is a major researcher, Danish researcher, Neil Skakkerbak, who's a pioneer in endocrine disruption, and has stated that this is the best way to reduce your body burden. Instead, give it to the children. As endocrinologists, we suggest that the Endocrine Society actively engages in lobbying for regulation seeking to decrease human exposure to the endocrine disrupting agents. So the solution is, as I finish up, don't freeze or heat food and beverages in plastic. You can now get glass containers with plastic lids, that's fine, as long as the food isn't contacting that. Freeze all your foods in those. So it's about $50 for 9 containers from Big W. Avoid tin food because you don't know if it's going to be lined with BPA or not. Food packaging, go back to basics, glass, ceramic, stainless steel. Avoid non-stick cookware, go with your stainless steel, it means a bit more elbow grease. Ceramic is fine, yep. Buy organic food when you can, because the pesticides are often a source of EDCs. Buy Australian made. I'm not going to tell you the stories of some of the things I've tested, and mattresses from China that are loaded with chemicals, etc. that we buy. We buy everything from Asia, and they don't follow the same mock health and safety guidelines that we have in Australia. So buy Australian made, because if the Australian company started loading those chemicals that we find from overseas, they would be shut down. So it's really important, especially your bedding and your furnishings. It's very important you buy Australian made. Expose new furnishings and bedding in the sun to allow them to outgas their chemicals more quickly, because UV is the best best way to enhance the outgassing of chemicals. Avoid waterproof furnishings. They are a huge problem, as perfluorinated compounds are also endocrine disrupting chemicals. Good ventilation, open windows and doors. You know, this 8-star energy rating where we're now building plastic bags for homes and then introducing, products from overseas that are loaded with chemicals that have got nowhere to go and stick to all the walls because we can't open a window anymore is a real problem. I speak to the building industry. I'm surprised they ever ask me back after I talk because they all look horrified and sort of by the end of the talk they sort of walk out like this, like, oh my God. Yeah, you should. I mean, you guys can make a difference. You can. The building designers and architects can prevent most of this with a bit of forethought. Vacuum cleaner. Where are these chemicals in the dust? Right in the breathing zone of our children. A HEPA filter doesn't cost much. You know, $600 for a good vacuum cleaner with a motorised head. I've got a video on my website, but also some good tips. And I actually rated the top 10 vacuum cleaners in Australia based on health. So if you've got kids with allergies, that's ideal.
What do HEPA filters do?
HEPA filters filter down to 0.3 microns. So they filter down. All your allergens start at about 5 microns and higher. Your hair is 100 microns in diameter. It filters down to 0.3. And very quickly, non-chemical forms of pest management. Do we need a tin of fly spray and chase around a house one fly to kill it? I mean, really, we need to change our attitudes. We need a fly swat. We need fly screens. We need not to have food hanging around. No perfume. Big one. If you get nothing out of today, please don't wear perfume. Perfume on clothing, no fragrances in your washing materials and things like that.
Not just skin contact.
No, fragrances in here are often a sign of skin-related allergies. I've had kids with flame retardants in their pyjamas causing itching and skin-related disorders during the night and in the morning because it's loaded with flame retardants because it's fireproof. I mean, who thinks about putting chemicals in flame retardants in case a fire jumps into the kid? I mean, you know, the thought that goes into this is ridiculous. But allergies and skin problems can be a big problem with chemicals and fragrances in the clothing. So go fragrance-free washing powders, especially if you're pregnant and if you're breastfeeding, etc. I'll just quickly finish up because I'm getting the nod. Cleaning products, use microfiber cloths. Cosmetics, less is best. My makeup remover is coconut oil. You know, I don't tend to wear foundation, I wear eyeliner, etc. And I'll go with the companies that I know are going to test each batch for lead because lead is a big problem. No tinted lipstick. Most tinted lipstick, even if it's organic, is likely to contain lead because when they mine those iron oxides and those pigments, lead is actually naturally in the ground. Avoid antibacterial products. You know, get your kids dirty and get them in the dirt. And wash their hands before they eat and after they touch a pet. Really, it's just simple. So that's who I am, a building biologist. I deal with a lot of tradies on how to wire home effectively. I deal with mould remediators for mould-related problems. I deal with medical people like yourself to try and connect this patient with this illness, with their house and with you so we can get together and try and help why these patients have chronic fatigue and other things like that. Author of Healthy Home, Healthy Family. I've got a lot of good, useful information on my website. Lots of videos, etc. and lots of tips on better paints and cosmetics and all those sort of things that you can explore. That's it. Thank you so much.